So welcome to part 3 everybody, almost done now. So if you're new and you haven't seen part 1 and part 2 of the Midnight Quilt, I will put a link in the description below and make a playlist. But we're at the point now where the top will be finished. At the end of this video, all the blocks will be made and I'm just about to piece it all together. There's just 2 seams left at the end of this video, so almost done. So last week in part 2 I'd finished C and D blocks and everything looked okay. I was quite happy with the way it was going. The way I'm designing this quilt, if you're not aware, is to make a block, put it on the design wall, then to design another block to go around that, and so on. And that has brought some issues with it, a new way for designing a quilt for me, and I'll talk about that. I'm going to review that process next week in the last video. But when I got to making block E, block D sort of threw up a few little issues. And I think it was because what I'm trying to do is to link all of the quilt together. So elements from inside the quilt I want to bring to the edge of the quilt, and I want it to be cohesive, colours and design wise. And so E, because it sat on the corner of the quilt, brought everything down, but then it led the way around the edge of the quilt for it to finish. And so I did have a few little design conundrums, I would call them, with a slither that touched the edge of D block and the side of E block. But in the end, I have managed to put a 3x1 set of blocks down D block, and I'll show you what that looks like. And so this is where I've got to so far. This is the design plan for blocks A, B, C and D. And this is block D, this little cornerstone. And so those strips with the orange half square triangles at the top will form the edges of block E. So once I'd sorted out the connection between block D and E, then the rest came together quite quickly. Like I said, I was bringing in elements from inside the quilt and the colours had already been selected. I'd limited the fabric colour choices and design to this Peacock Paisley by Bethany Salt. And so I knew the colour range I was going to use and I knew how I wanted the feel of the quilt to be. I wanted it to end, the brightness from the centre, and this edge pattern, this edge design, to be a sort of transition to the darkness at the edge of the quilt. And I'll show you how block E came together. And this is the design that I've come up with for block E. There are 8 parts to it. So there's 4 for the left and 4 for the right. So they're on both sides of F block, which is still yet to be designed. And interestingly, I was all right with that part of the design process. Having a block there, knowing that I was going to fill it at some point, was okay. I didn't mind it being blank. I was able to work around that and just think I'll deal with that later. So that at all wasn't an issue with this design process. So there are 8 of these, 4 of each side. And you can just make out there's some little orange squares within square and yellow ones, and the same on the other side. And then there's this green with the orange flower bud, which is that. So I've brought that flower bud down from this block here, so that's the continuation of that. So like I say, all I'm trying to do is to fill in that space, the space I've allocated for E block, and try and bring in the different elements from the quilt. And each of those squares on the graph paper represented a 3-inch square. So I was just taking little bits from the quilt and putting them in gaps where there were gaps. And then I've got these on point grey background squares, and the reason I've chosen that is because this really throws the lights back, different shades in the half light. So I think that works well. And it acts as a nice boundary between the big blocks in the middle and the navy blue on the outside. So last week in the design process, I showed you how light altered the qualities of the design and the colours in this quilt top, in these blocks. And it was this grey that sort of had quite a big impact on that design decision, because the grey itself during the daytime light, the full light, looked quite muted against the pink floral. But in the dim light and in the midnight, that all of the different shades within that grey really popped. And so that's why I chose that grey in that design block. And I'm going to make the stars from this pink and blue. And the reason I chose those were because of the way they behaved in the half light, the way we saw those colours. And they did glow, and I think partly that's to do with that lovely yellow that's in that blue background. And it's a 4 square by 8 square block, and I'm going to assemble it in 3 parts. So it's quite a big block, and that's why I broke it down into 3 elements. So there was the little slither to start with, then there was the 4x4, and then there was the little block on the end. So not too hard or time consuming if you tackle it in small pieces like that. Now I want to complete these little 4x4 pinwheel blocks. And so I want to create 8 pinwheels. So I'm using 3-inch half square triangles, and I'll sew those together. And now I want to carry out the points. So I have the navy back with the pink floral on the top as the background and the deep navy on the bottom. So I'll join those together. And now I want to put a side on the left and on the right. But these are directional, and so I'm going to take 4 from the pile, complete 4, and then I'll do the next 4. And that's what the sides look like. So I'm carrying out the pink and the blue points of this little star flower and creating on point grey squares on the sides. And then on the bottom, there's the dark navy with the 2 little green leaves. So that's okay. It's only the top square within squares that make this directional. And there's an orange on the left and there's a yellow on the right. And when they're sewn together, they'll look like that. And to be honest, if you want to make it easier, you could use the same colours within those squares within squares. I wouldn't admit them, I would add a little pop of colour there, but you could choose. The only reason I chose those colours was because I wanted to clump together the orange in that corner, and you'll see why in a moment or two. So now I have to make 4 with the orange square and the yellow square reversed. Everything else is the same. And that will fit on the bottom row next to that first slither. And you can see now the on-point grey squares are beginning to take shape. So those are the first 2 elements finished, and then there's just the one left. So there's a little bit of detail in there, square within square and a rosebud, and it's the on-point square. So I'll work my way through that step by step, and I'll take you with me if you're interested. And the first thing I need to do is to make 8 on-point squares. So I've got the pink floral at the top and the deep navy at the bottom. And now I want to divide those 8 on-point squares into 2 sets. And on the one set, I will put a half on-point square to the right. And then on the other one, I will put a half on-point square to the left. So I'll sew those together. So if you're chain piecing, these elements come together quite quickly. So you've got the little star, there were 8 of those. This on-point square, there's 8 of those. So they come together quite quickly, and it does speed up the process. And I've also sewn a row of 3 3-inch squares to the bottom of those blocks. And that, of course, is personal preference. You don't have to put 3 3-inch squares together. you could have a 3" by 8" square, that would be fine. The reason I like to do it is because it helps me with my quilting process. So when I'm quilting this on my small domestic machine, I'm looking to manoeuvre the fabric through the throat of the machine, and I'm looking for guidelines. So I will sew this quilt on the diagonal, so it'll be straight across each square. Sometimes I might do it in a ditch, but then again I'm still following the lines that I've sewn in the seams. And I just need to put a row of 3" squares to the top. So on the left hand side we have a yellow square within a square, and then I have one of those orange flower buds in the middle, and the orange flower bud is pointing towards the centre of the quilt, and then it's reversed on the opposite side. So I'll sew that together. So those are the 3 parts to block E. So on the top left block you can see that orange square, and that fits next to the orange floral in the corner. And now I need to join those 3 pieces together, and then I have to think about block F. And from the details you can see how I put this block together. So I wanted those on point squares to form a border around the outside, so I penciled those in. And then I've got that little pointed star that I created in the blue and the pink. I put those, and then I worked those little blocks around it. So I'm trying to bring some of the blocks that appear elsewhere in the quilt out to the edge. So when I just pencil in the shapes of the blocks, that gives me an idea that the shapes within the quilt will work together, and then I'll add the colour afterwards. And that's how the E blocks will fit onto the quilt. So D block now rounds off that corner, and then E carries us along. I need to think about where we're going next. Well, my first decision is to bring out the points of the dark green that are in this block, to carry those out into this little 4x4 that's left. So they'll be the top part of the block, and that's this green here. And now I want to use those 2 colours in the block. Well, I think I'm going to go with this little design here. I've brought some green half square triangles to the edge of the quilt, and this is quite a big bold block there. It ties in that green from the block above. I think that will look nice. So there's coal that appears in this block here, and that will tie in nicely across there. Yeah, I think that should work. So I'm going to make those blocks now, and we'll have a look and see what that looks like. And that's my fabric selection for this block. And this is block F, and there are 4 of those. So I'm going to start off with a little blue and coral pinwheel for the centre. Do you know that if I was going to walk into a fabric store and put 2 pieces together, I wouldn't have chosen these, but I really like the way they work together. So if you recall, there were 5 different designs in the fat quarter bundle that I bought from this peacock, paisley peacock design, and I was continually trying to make these designs work together, and that is why I chose colours, I think, that I wouldn't normally, but I was happy with the way that they came together. So I'll show you the sides and the top and bottom now. So the sides fit like that, with the navy blue solid at the bottom. And on the bottom, the blue and the coral continue their half square triangles coming out. And then on the navy blue solid bottom, we have those vibrant green leaves, and on the top there's that deeper green, and there are 2 squares of the floral on each side of that. I've had to use half square triangles to try and make my fabric go as far as I can. I would have used 3" squares in that instance, but today I couldn't, because this is all I have left of that fabric. And that's the finished block. I think that looks really lovely, and that's how they'll fit on the quilt. So it's a nice bold block in the centre of each side. Now I want to add a 3" navy blue strip all the way around the edge, and that will protect the points near the end, but I'm also going to add something else. Let me show you. And so what I'm going to do is, in the middle of that 3" navy blue solid border, I'm going to add a green half square triangle, well, 2 put together, because I think that'll just take the design to the very edge of the quilt, and I think it will look nice. But before I do that, I have stood back and decided I want to add a little bit more of that solid orange in the left hand corner, well, all 4 corners, and I'll show you the difference that it makes. So look at the green and orange flower shape, and now spot the difference. So now I'm going to unpick that one block and replace it with those little orange, solid orange floral squares. And so that design choice, that change in colour, was purely because of the colour choice that I'd made in an earlier block. There was quite a lot of that dominant orange in block C it was, and I just wanted to bring some more of that out to the edge of the quilt. And although it was only a little tiny change, I think it's made all the difference. So I just have to make sure that the square iron pick is the one on the diagonal to the solid navy blue half square triangles. You don't need to do that if your colour selections are working well. So I put that green triangle on the end of that block, but it's just too heavy, and so I cut a 3/4 inch slither off the end of that block, added the navy blue so it measures 3 inches, and I think that works much better, much happier now. And so with the design process, it's always worth just taking a second or two just to step back, perhaps go and have a cup of coffee or a little walk around, and then come back and look again. And then just think about the changes that you're making, because I am much happier with those small triangles. It's such a tiny little change, but I think it does make a difference. It does to me anyway. I'd have always looked at that and felt that that large triangle was a little bit too heavy, but I really wanted the green to come further to the edge, and so I'm happy now. And that's finally it. All the blocks are complete. So now I've just got to join the blocks together, put the border on and quilt it. So at this point, I hadn't seen what this quilt might look like together. I've seen snippets of it, corners or the centre all together, but I hadn't seen the whole thing together. And so when I started to lay it out, it was the first time really I'd seen it. So it was quite exciting. So I'm just about to start to put the blocks together, and I'm going to construct the centre part as if it's an iron patch. So we have block A in the centre, cornerstones are block B, and the fillers between are block C. So the only thing I have to be aware of is that the peacocks are all standing in the right direction, and that the navy blue half square triangles are all pointing towards the centre. If I get that right, everything should be good. And I'll just have a quick word about pressing. So, to iron or not to iron, the big question. It's something I get asked quite a lot about really, ironing, pressing. And so I think my rule of thumb is, if the fabric that I've sewn together is on the straight grain and not too stretchy, then I usually iron. So if I'm doing log cabins or squares within squares or rectangles and squares, I'll probably iron as I go because it's not too stretchy. When I'm making half square triangles and the fabric is cut then on the bias so it is stretchy, what I tend to do is when I make a big block, I will sew it all together without ironing, and then when it's finished, the one block, I will press from the centre out to the last seam on the outside. I won't go beyond that because that last seam will hold everything below that in place, and so I will iron all the way up to there and leave it. And then when I join those blocks together and sew those together, then I will press over those seams, and so on. That's how I'll work my way around the whole quilt. I hope that helps. So that's all joined now. That's one piece, and all the seams nested nicely together. So all of our points are preserved and everything's looking good. And now I'm going to join together the blocks for the left hand side and the right hand side, and then I'll attach those. I thought I'd better lay out all of the blocks just to check that there's nothing untoward with any of these placements before I sew it all together. So it looks quite a big one, this one for me. I'm putting the borders on as I go, so I'll get back to sewing the sides on now. I've sewn the sides on, so I just need to do those two seams, and that's the top piece. To be honest, if I had the capability, I would take out that navy another 6 inches all the way around. But I think I'm already stretched to the fullness of my capabilities. I'm not sure how I'm going to get on basting this and quilting it, but I'm always up for a challenge. So I'll sew these together now. So I know now I have finished the quilt, so you'll see that next week. And it finishes at 76 inches square, which is quite large for me because, like I say, I work on a small domestic sewing machine and it is heavy. It's a heavy quilt, but I did manage it and it does look beautiful. But if you can manage to grow that quilt and take that dark out, like I say, another few inches, I think that would really make it impactful, the design in the centre. I'm still very happy with the way that this quilt has come out, but I will show you that next week. So if you are still with me, I'd like to thank you very much for your company, and please look after yourselves, take really good care of yourself, and I will see you next week. So, bye.